and Shri Rahul Kumar Sharma ji. He's the Senior Managing Editor of Sage. As a token of respect, we would like to, please. As a token of respect, we would like to present plants to our guests. Ms. Sheila Sabu, Administrative Officer of CSD, will present a plant to the Chair, Shri K.N. Srivastava sir. Dr. Purnima Manoharan, Book Review Editor of Social Change, will present a plant to our speaker, Professor Veena Das. Ms. Gurmeet Kaur, Assistant Editor, Social Change, will present a plant to our collaborative partner, Mr. Rahul Kumar Sharma. I now hand over to the chair, Shri K.N. Srivastava sir, for further proceedings. Thank you, sir.
Good evening to all of you, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this 8th Social Change Annual Lecture. Our President, Dr. Srinath Reddy, was supposed to preside today's program. Is held up in some other program, so I have to deputize for him here today. Before we proceed, may I request my colleague, Professor Riaz Ahmed, to extend a formal welcome to all the participants who are here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Srivastava. I welcome everybody present here on the dais as well as there in front of me to this 8th Social Change Annual Lecture on this exciting theme, the female voice reinstituting life. It is good to see that distinguished scholars are present there also in front of me. I can see Ashish Nandi Sahab, Rajiv Bhargava Sahab, and many others. So this itself speaks about the attraction this theme and this speaker have created. Everybody knows that to deliver this lecture, we have with us this highly celebrated scholar and teacher, Veena Das, who, as my colleague just told you, is a professor emerita at Johns Hopkins University, and whose research interests range from anthropology, philosophy, and literature. Professor Das, widely respected for her thought-provoking ideas, has been honored with numerous prestigious awards and honorary doctorates. She is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and a corresponding fellow of the British Academy. So many years of teaching and research and an extensive list of highly acclaimed publications have left her imprint across generations and geographical borders. And through the translation of her writings into several foreign and Indian languages, her ideas have also crossed over linguistic barriers. Professor Das, we are privileged to have you as our guest speaker today. Thank you very much for coming here. And we are honored to have with us Mr. K.N. Srivastava as the chair of today's event. Mr. Srivastava took over as the IIC director in 2019 and has been instrumental in taking the center to new heights. His career journey has spanned various institutions, including the Indian Foreign Service, central services, and IAS. He made significant contributions to the Karnataka administration, public sector units, and the Government of India, serving in ministries of culture, civil aviation, and external affairs. His commitment to excellence has been evident throughout his career. Mr. Srivastava, thank you for accepting my request to chair this event despite your busy schedule. Thank you very much. We are also delighted to welcome Mr. Rahul Sharma, Senior Managing Editor from Sage Publications. Mr. Sharma excels in optimizing editorial workflows, enhancing quality, and ensuring compliance with publication ethics. Thank you, Mr. Sharma, for joining us. Ladies and gentlemen, I just want to say a few words about the Social Change Annual Lecture Series. It's a sort of acknowledgement of the contribution made by the people before us. The series began in 2019. It owes its origin to the efforts of Muchkund Dubey, then CSD President, and Manoranjan Mohanty, then Social Change Editor. First 3 lectures had already taken place before I joined. Meaningful support from Muchkund Dubey as CSD President and Manoranjan Mohanty as the chair of the CSD's Research and Publication Committee helped me take the baton forward. Manoranjan Mohanty is no longer the RPC chair, and Muchkund Dubey is no longer with us. The support of the current CSD President Padma Bhushan K. Srinath Reddy and Professor Rama Baru, the new RPC chair, has facilitated the onward journey of this lecture series. The Social Change Annual Lecture Series has had the privilege of hosting lectures by celebrated scholars such as Gopal Guru, Uma Chakravarti, G.N. Devi, Beena Agarwal, Madhav Gadkal, Barbara Harris-White, Krishna Kumar, and now Veena Das. In the backdrop of the theme of today's lecture, allow me to highlight the fact that the lecture series has consciously shaped itself as an equal platform for the female voice as well, with 8 lectures featuring 4 male and 4 female scholars. I am grateful for the sustained support from IIC, Sage Publications, and CSD, which has made this lecture series a prestigious event. For today's event, I am particularly indebted to Mr. K.N. Srivastava, Ms. Smriti Sudhakaran, Associate Editor Marketing Services of Sage, and Ms. Sheila Sabu, Administrative Officer of CSD. Their guidance and their teams have made meaningful contribution to organizing this program. Last but not least, I want to express my gratitude to my own team, my colleagues at Social Change. Managing Editor Ankita Goyal, Book Review Editor Purnima M, and Assistant Editor Gurmeet Kaur. Their support in conceiving and executing this event has been invaluable. I look forward to an exciting lecture by Professor Das, which will be followed by questions and answers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Riaz Ahmed. As Riaz has mentioned, the Social Change Annual Lecture is the most prestigious event which CSD organizes every year. And eminent people have delivered this lecture in the past. And today also we are going to have delivery of this lecture by a very, very renowned anthropologist, Professor of Anthropology, Professor Veena Das. It is my proud privilege to introduce Professor Das in slightly details. Professor Veena Das is a professor emerita in anthropology at Johns Hopkins University. She is recipient of honorary doctorates from several universities and numerous other prestigious awards, including John Simon Guggenheim Fellowship Award in 2009. She taught at Delhi School of Economics for more than 30 years and at the New School before she joined Johns Hopkins University in in the year 2000. She is a fellow of American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and in 2019 was elected as a corresponding fellow of the British Academy. Her research interests range across anthropology, philosophy, and literature. She is particularly interested in how the textures and the contours of everyday life can be rendered with the everyday and the event conjoined in making of the honorary and the critical. Among her many books are Life and Words, Violence and the Descent into the Ordinary, then Affliction, Health, Disease, Poverty, Textures of Ordinary, Doing Anthropology after Wittgenstein, Slum Acts, and most recent co-edited volume, A Matter of Detail. Her writings have been translated into many languages, including Chinese, Spanish, French, Portuguese, Italian, Hindi, Bangla, Japanese, Korean, etc. Professor Das is going to speak to us today on the female voice, the reinstituting life. The gathering in the audience indicates as to how much of interest this lecture has really generated. Before I invite her to deliver her talk, let me say a few things. One is my request to all of you to kindly put your mobile phone on silent mode. Second thing is that after she has delivered her talk, we are going to devote sufficient time on question and answer. And we'll try to finish the entire program, say about 75 minutes or so. So may I request you, Professor Veena Das, to kindly deliver your lecture. Would you like to go over there?
Mr. Srivastava, Professor Riaz Ahmed, members of the audience. I'm actually really very honored to be giving this annual lecture at the IIC on the general theme of social change. And I want to thank especially the social change team at the CSD for their hospitality, for their intellectual stimulation, SAGE for, above all, also sponsoring the lecture and the printed version that you will get, I think, at the end of the lecture. And I want to start by just saying that it's also a sad day that my teacher, Professor Bete, and he was a colleague and my teacher, passed away yesterday. And it's not accidental that the first book of sociology when I was 19 that he introduced me to was Durkheim's Suicide. And with some perversity, I have a very stringent critique of Durkheim's Suicide in this lecture. It's also just wonderful to see so many friends, people I haven't seen for a while, but who've always been in my thoughts. And I'm really, really very, very grateful to be given this opportunity to speak. So I begin, I have one request. I tend to mumble, and so at the back or somewhere, if you see that I'm not reaching out to you, just call out so that I can bring the mic in alignment with myself. Okay. So I begin today not with an argument, but with a mood. One could call this mood as reflecting the darkness of a time that leads a sober historians such as Reinhard Koselleck to say that the disposition to kill should be seen as somehow natural to the human, and that leads Stanley Cavell, the writer of Emersonian perfectionism, to call human life itself as a crime scene, the inhuman as a possibility of the human, not its aberration. Together, these writers show the absurdity of a vision that would make anthropology or sociology as the science of variation of the human condition, as if we know in advance what the limits of the human body or the human voice are. Nor can a project be one of providing a correction to different versions of the civilizing mission through which Western thought has managed to cast historical failures of other societies as their ontological condition, whereas the violence of the West was cast as a temporary aberration. I do not look for very subtle formulations of this claim, but instead cite the philosopher Emmanuel Levinas, who has no hesitation in saying that while there are many cultures whose national literatures contribute to ontological pluralism, I cite, it is Europe which, alongside its numerous atrocities, invented the idea of de-Europeanization, which in turn represents a victory of European generosity. He adds that Europe has many things to be reproached for. Its history has been that of blood and war, but it is also the place where this blood and war have been regretted and constitute a bad conscience of Europe, which is also the retour of Europe. I do not dismiss the many philosophical achievements of Levinas, but I also feel a compulsion to ask if we can go beyond an expression of indignation and explore what enables this kind of formulation of European superiority, especially since Levinas can also claim in the same breath that, quote, there is a kind of envelopment of all thinking by the European subject, all thinking by the European subject. And he says this without knowing anything of Buddhism. In other words, you need not know anything in particular to be able to know everything. Without being able to fully justify the paths I take to address this issue, perhaps because of the mood in which I write, given the moment, I think one aspect of the diagnosis of the arrogance of the claim that all thought is enveloped by Europe, I wager, is that the history of the subject in Europe shows that the modern subject emerges by painful exclusions of certain kinds of negative figures, particularly the criminal and the mad. My concern here is not to trace the slow historical shifts in the making of the subject to subjection, to that of government of self and other, and finally to the culture of confession. I am interested in another aspect of the problematic of exclusion. A figure that seems to be missing in the conceptual formation of exclusion in Foucault, who propagates this entire notion of the subject having a history, is the figure of the woman. I do not mean to say that women are completely missing. They are very much present in the story of the government of the household. But what I mean to say is that they do not appear in the story of the history of the subject. It is as if their confinement to the domain of the household somehow disqualifies them to be the protagonists in Foucault's theory of the history of the subject. Now it would be obvious that the kind of dividing practices through which the figure of the criminal or that of the mad person could be excluded from the social body could not be applied to women. After all, their participation in the making of life, sustaining forms of life, providing the labor of care to others is not in question. And one could go further and say that Foucault also encounters the cruelties perpetrated by some women on children, for example in abnormal or in what he calls the disorders of the family, as well as the cruelties women are themselves subjected to. Yet the only move he makes towards the question of subjectivation is to suggest that it is the criminal acts of such women which make them available as subjects for the knowledge projects of psychiatry as a discipline. The only other avatar in which we encounter women is the figure of the hysteric women, where he feels that the coupling of power and resistance becomes frayed because the hysteric woman, through the excess of expression, is capable of continuously producing new symptoms. Thus, two pictures emerge here for what place is made for women in the theory of the subject. The first is that absorbed within the household, the woman's presence is unremarkable, too quotidian to be of theoretical interest. The head of the household should learn to govern women as he learns to manage wealth, cattle, lands, but she seems to leave no other traces in the archive. The second picture is of the woman who has committed a crime, often against children, who remains unintelligible and hence is a subject of interest to psychiatry, or the hysteric, who also defies the psychiatrist by her ability to constantly produce new subjects of her condition. New symptoms of her condition. As Cavell had articulated this issue, on one side is the suffocation of the woman's voice, and on the other side is the excessive expression. Underlying both conditions is the evasion of life as it is lived, both when it is being sustained through the labor of women against the many misfortunes and tragedies to which the living are subject, and the fragile network of things and people that sustain life get broken. When relations fade, neglect and abandonment seeps in the everyday, leading to small and large defeats. My claim is that a response to the violence secreted in everyday life demands that life be reinstituted. So I'm not saying reformed, I'm saying life be reinstituted. But that project leads us to a radical redefinition of the place of the woman, not as an abstract figure of thought, but through singularity of life as encountered in individual men and women. If anthropology had once prided itself for showing the empirical unfolding of the sheer diversity of life forms that could be again gathered through the application of theory under such abstractions as variations of the same human condition or the acquisition of culture as second nature, this project could be accomplished only at the cost of imposing concepts from above that masked a pernicious epistemic domination under the guise of theory. But let us step back for a moment and ask, can we change the ground of these discussions by not so much refuting these arguments and thus placing our faith once again in reason to correct itself, but by asking what might help us loosen the grip of the demand that we move from the particularity of our encounters with real human beings in the generality of concepts that can be then stamped with what Foucault called the Cartesian moment in the career of thought. I am not advocating an escape from reason into some other realm, call it the realm of imagination or emotion, or resorting to a sentimentality and nostalgia for times past, but proposing that we arrive at our own inhabitation of reason through other routes. One possible route, I wager, is to make a shift in the weight assigned to the ordinary, and how it might establish different norms on how life is sustained through the female subject that invests authority in speaking and writing of the ordinary. So the next section is life as re-inhabitation. In a remarkable commentary on the project of anthropology as a description of life as a rehabilitation through a descent into the ordinary, Jocelyn Benoist, this is the very famous French philosopher, considers the implications of taking life not primarily as an object that one can see from the outside, as if it had boundaries that separated it from other things in the world, but something we render only through a mode of participation or accompaniment. The passage from my book, Life and Words, that he found most compelling for this vision, he calls it one of the peaks of the book, is the following. Excuse me for quoting myself, but actually I'm quoting Benoit quoting me. There is a complex relation between a life and life, so that how one lives in relation to one's own and others' deaths turns out to be a project of how one protects not only a form of life over disputations, criticisms, and recognitions in the fact of change, but also how one protects the institution of life as lived in the singular. For Benoit, this passage should be read in the background of my claim that anthropological work is at its best when it can acknowledge the limits of the knowing subject and a disappointment with knowledge, or rather, a disappointment with a picture of knowledge, in which the expertise of the anthropologist is said to be laid on the messiness of lives to make it speak to the universalizing project of determining answers to such metaphysical questions such as, what is life? What is the human condition? In Benoit's words, quote, something anyway may still remain of the philosopher's arrogance in the posture of the anthropologist. That is to say, the position of the one who knows. The agents do not know why they do what they do, and thus who they are, but the scientist knows. It is not so much an achievement as a definition. I think it's a brilliant line to say this is not something that's been achieved by definition. The scientist knows, right? Although many anthropologists make similar appeals to lived experience, the next steps they take either lead them into a labor of the negative or in the creation yet again of new boundaries between experience near and experience distant, reason and emotion, and so on. Underlying both these stances is a masking of the real problem at hand, that we cannot substitute our own disappointment with expertise by assuming that someone else, in this case the natives, would somehow have a better grasp over their reality. That is what I'm arguing is not, the answer is not that we don't know, but they know. My claim is that attention to the ordinary and the everyday asks for an acknowledgement that in ordinary life people might not act on the basis of anything but fragmentary knowledge. But they might not be masters of their situation or have a God's eye view of the world in which their actions unfold, as Austin's essay on excuses and Lodge's interpretation of the vulnerability of our knowledge show. Yet concepts that Wittgenstein calls humble, rather than the super concepts scholars long for, are born and enable actions to be taken within these situations of uncertainty, contingency, and the force of sheer accidents. As Wittgenstein famously said, here one can only describe and say, this is what human life is like. I mean, I would have liked to translate it as such as life, right? It is not a reason for distrusting the work done in the everyday, but acknowledging that everyday life is indeed lined with skepticism and failure, but that re-establishing life in the everyday is not a matter of dramatic once-for-all event, but something that is undertaken repeatedly, quotidianly, in the thick of things falling apart, as women know. To the poet Fayaz, who bemoans, "Ek bakiya udheda ek siya, yu umr basar kab hoti hai," you know, a stitch, unraveling it, stitching again. How can life be lived like that? My interlocutors in the field would remind me, if not through words, then through their gestures or their actions, that it was precisely within that mode that life was lived. Let me step back here and try to decipher why such a vision of life is seen as threatening to so many founding figures of anthropology. Here is Claude Lévi-Strauss, whose majestic work on mythology showed an underlying logic in primitive thought, rescuing it from the charges of emotivism, but of course, on condition that ethnography does not cede the task of thinking through myths to the conceptual formulations that the natives have of it. So here is the citation. We would risk committing sociology to a dangerous path, even a path of destruction, if we then went one step further and reduced social reality to the conception that man, savage man even, has of it. And actually it's not accidental that Levinas says it took a European to see what savage thought is really about. So Lévi-Strauss speaks not of life, but of social reality, as if standing in a frontal relation to us. The implication is that what we as anthropologists or ethnographers see is reality as something solid, but what they, the natives, see is only putative reality. This adjectival modification of reality is not from Lévi-Strauss, but from McDowell, who uses it to say that some experiences, such as feeling wounded by the cruelty done to animals, because for some people animals may feel like companions, are not hallucinatory, but their reality does not qualify as reality for everyone. It is indeed their reality, but for purposes of analysis, it only reaches the level of putative reality. Social reality then qualifies as reality when it stands closest to natural categories, as the concept of second nature implies, in relation to what is assumed to be first nature. And I'm happy to talk more about it, but this is what has allowed recently, for example, 40 philosophers, led by philosophers from nowhere else but Oxford, to say that transgender identities are fake identities, right? It's because of this idea that second nature ultimately has to have a theory of first nature. And that's where it seems to me that the introduction of something like putative reality does enormous damage. My own argument on what is at stake, as I hinted in the opening paras of this lecture, is to shift the weight from reality, social or natural, to the hosting of life in defining the subject of anthropology, because it allows me to see how violence and forms of death are secreted within forms of life, rather than taking reality as the object of analysis and then cutting it into social, natural, putative, or whatever, something that confronts one from the outside, as in the famous wall that blocks you as you try to walk through it, as if it were a curtain. I mean, it's very interesting that all these arguments in favor of saying reality is solid actually assume reality is hurtful. But that reality can be joyful is something which does not come through precisely because life is actually, in positing reality in this way, life is in fact evaded. Again and again in the history of anthropology, life has emerged as a candidate and then has been set aside in favor of such abstractions as social reality or submerged within other concepts such as society as a sui generis entity. As an example of the withdrawal from the everyday as a condition for anthropological thought to arise, consider the difficulties that Durkheim confesses to when he speaks to arrive at the notion of collective consciousness by merging of the individual consciousnesses. This is a long quotation, I'll just give you a small amount of it. The product of this synthesis, that is of individual consciousnesses into collective consciousness, is a whole world of feelings, ideas, images that follow their own laws once they're born. Indeed, the life thus unleashed enjoys such great independence that it sometimes plays about in forms that have no aim or utility of any kind, but only for the pleasures of affirming itself. This is, I think, what scholars find unbearable in one way. The question of Durkheim, his synthesis of individual consciousness into a single collective consciousness, is that of determining how does the individual come to be attached to the collective. That is, I'm not doubting that there is a whole lot in Durkheim, where he talks about prohibitions, he talks about asceticism, he talks about the manner in which the use of punishment to create future memory is imposed on the individual, which is why society is ever present. But why would they be attached to this notion? This is what he has to say. For Durkheim, this attachment to the collective has a quality of a kind of delirium, in which women are afforded very little participation. He says, stimulated by the collective experience of congregating amidst the sacred, participations are pulled away from ordinary occupations and preoccupations and moved to the point of delirium akin to religious state. Right? So what attaches them to the collective consciousness is not a rational acquisition, that was Kant's view. For Durkheim, it's a certain kind of delirium from which women are, in fact, excluded. In his work on suicide, Durkheim makes his exclusion of women from collective life even more explicit. Quote, as she lives outside of community existence more than man, she is less penetrated by it, society is less necessary to her because she is less impregnated with sociality. She has few needs in this direction and satisfies them easily. Penetrated, impregnated, the imagination of the social and the abstract society as sui generis turns out, after all, to be another version of a masculine creation, a sexualization of the social in language in which women have no position as embodied subject, except as bodies to be penetrated and impregnated. The quotidian and the mundane, which at one point Durkheim recognizes to be necessary for men to endure life, finds no recognition at the level of theorizing society. This flight from the ordinary and from the mundane activities that sustain everyday life through the labor of care performed by women stands in need of serious correction. And for that correction to occur, the picture of knowledge that permits such language to be used against not only women, but also against other modes of subjectivation needs to be not just amended, but abandoned. In the last section of this paper, I will now give you one detailed example of the project, of what is it to be, in fact, creating a certain kind of way of thinking about the female voice. Those of you who read the lecture will find that there are more examples which are given, but I'm basically trying to turn to, I want to give you an example of where theory resides. And it seems to me that theory over here resides not in being able to have very big terms, but in the exquisite writing in some ways, and very audacious writing of Krishna Sopti, and there are others that I could have taken, but I want to take her writing. So the 4 volumes that I take from Krishna Sopti's writing are called Hum Hashmat, and I claim that they provide the finest example of a rendering of life that is both a critique of the sexualization of language and a striving toward a different kind of we that does not efface the I. It is perhaps a version of moral perfectionism in the female voice. Krishna Sopti has described how one day in her study, as she was writing, she sensed the presence of Hashmat, a male presence, but not with any sense of being alien to her. She explains that when within the same writer emerged 2 personalities, 2 colors, 2 idioms, I saw this situation when I sensed the presence of Hashmat. I was taking his measure not as someone else, but as of myself. The linguistic idiom through which his visage unfastened was neither new nor indeed that of a stranger or an outsider. That Hashmat is not an imaginary but a literal presence impresses on Sopti, and she allows herself a touch of surprise. As she says, I did not find in Hashmat's writing anything new or out of the ordinary. His thought was not borrowed from somewhere else, nor were the character of his words alien. Perhaps Hashmat was the form that the many layers of the city took. This is one of the most important statements I've ever come across, which is to say that Hashmat and Krishna and Sopti, right? Three, I call it a samas, right? The way that they appear over here is actually the layers of the city, right? It doesn't have to say very big words. It's absolutely, I think, one of the fantastic acts of theorizing. He says perhaps Hashmat was the form that many layers of the city took. This was also not a reinvention of Sopti, yet there was one event that was wondrous for Sopti, and this is that when she wrote as Hashmat, the handwriting became sliding from right to left, whereas hers own was straight. And she never managed to write by finishing, by putting the top line. So the letters have a certain wildness about them. So while I do not have the space within the confines of this lecture to elaborate all the details, grammatical and aesthetic, that go into the compound word, that is the samas of Sopti, Hashmat, Krishna, the bold vision of bringing the self towards a completion lies precisely in her being able to accept Hashmat in an undramatic way, as if his appearance was as natural and ordinary as the sun rising from the sky every morning. I relate here three scenes. First is the scene of Sopti's writerly self, and here is the voice of the street orator. The second scene that I take is, the fact that the Krishna always maintained a civil distance between herself and her characters, but there's one scene that happens in which, her famous character Mitra Marjani actually slides into Sopti. So that's the second scene. And the third scene that I want to do, I call Hashmat's gift. And I won't take away the surprise from you, but there's something in which I think those who knew Krishna know very well that she never spoke in Punjabi. If you tried to speak to her in Punjabi, she would respond in Hindi, right? And, she would constantly say, yes, Amrita is a Punjabi writer, I am a Hindi writer, right? So what Hashmat gives her is actually for a while to recover or to overcome this taboo on Punjabi that she has. So Hashmat speaks, the first example, the street orator. Hashmat's mode of initiating a critique is to greet his addresses, usually a writer or editor, through terms of address that I heard many times when I was young, during meetings on street corners, in election rallies, and in less refined circles of street-level poets during musharas. I grew up in a basti, and so it was very common for people to just hold a mushara, and people would just give their little poetries, recitations in these things. So, for example, for example, Hashmat might say, Dosto, Pyaryo, Janab, Aji Sahab, right? Brother, right? Not the brother, but brother, and sometimes comrade. So these are phrases dripping with sarcasm or affection, depending on whether he's addressing an adversary or a friend. The simple but powerful grammatical device of the vocative is one indication we have that Hashmat is a male entity, adept in Urdu, though also proficient in highly Sanskritic Hindi with words used like stones thrown in some calm waters. Let us savor the first example of Hashmat's confrontation with Rakesh Vats, a politically well-connected Hindi writer whose column urging the purification of Hindi by expelling all words from other languages, especially Urdu and Farsi, was published in the influential Hindi magazine Sarika in 1985. Hashmat's rejoinder, published in the same magazine, is called Sant Ka Pitara. And if you've seen Sant Ka Pitara, it's not just a basket, right? Because there is the snake. And so there is venomous speech in that, which he allows to let loose. This is a small example of how a practice rather than simply a nominal reference to which one can point is embedded in the word. There's a deeper point here, which is that concepts are not necessarily words. They are practices, right? And so just by calling it Samkapitara, there's something quite fantastic that she does through the voice of Hashmat. So take the first line, the self-introduction by Hashmat, who fixes the persona of the addressee, that is Rakesh Vats, more than it introduces Hashmat. The first line of Hashmat is a battle cry, and this is the line. In the service of the street performer and the crowd pleaser, Madmebaz, are we. Hashmat offers his adab. Since by profession you are a street performer, that is, you're a Madmebaz, you should have no objection being called a Madmebaz. You object to this appellation? Never mind. We will call you with another. Rest assured, we do not intend to trouble you or unmask you. Where can we have the audacity to sully your reputation? In your enlightened mind, there burns a 30-volt milky bulb. And in here, in our minds, just a bulb with zero power, right? I mean, you have to kind of imagine the power of this street oratory. It is not high oratory, it's the kind of street oratory through which through which the criticism against the purification of Hindi and very, very Sanskritic words that Rakesh Vats used were in fact offered. So these matters, so, at one place he says that if Punjabi, Braj, Hindi, Apabhransh have all left their impression on Hindi and a new ground has given it space to move forward, why is your wrong eye twitching? Aapki galat aankh kyun phadak rahi hai? So, these matters come up in a dialogue between Sopti and Krishna Baldev Ved, but remain unresolved. So, Ved is insistent that Hashmat is Sopti's imagination. It's her craft. And Sopti says no. Hashmat is what actually, from the cities, from the many languages, from every street corner of the city, my craft has been formed through that. I am not the one who's actually the master of this craft. And this comes out, I don't have the great details, but this comes out in her practice of writing, right? We'll see. Only when she withdraws can she actually write, right? Somebody else, something else has to come up in order for her to withdraw. A compelling example from Sopti is the reference to how different her characters are in each novel and how much the little ditties, the snatches of songs on the calls of the hawkers, the water carriers, the kulfi seller, with his starched clothes are different in their cadence and how they give reality to the city, right? So it's life which gives reality, not reality which gives life, right? Some of the floating verses in her novels are what she had heard even as a child and has been unable to forget. I'll just give you one example. Ek Chavanni Jairam Ji ki, Ek Chavanni Adha Bars. So, it brings this entire thing. People are going for a walk in the Mughal gardens in the morning. You take 2 4-anna bits. One you will give to the person who says Jairam Ji ki, and one you will give to the one who comes forward and says other words. No big things about communal harmony, and so on and so forth. It's there in absolutely everyday practices. So this is the Hindi honed out of the habit of going out every morning and actually interacting with people. And these are the signs she gathers as she surrenders herself to the compulsion of the story that is arising in her. So just 2 more quick this thing. So the other scene that I have there in the lecture, you will find longer descriptions of it, longer discussion of it. So in introducing herself to Hashmat, she says 1,000 times did we bow before time. Hazar bar satka kiya, right? This time a yes. Every time the same voice returns, no. She comments, friends, if in our inheritance we received a no, then what is it to be done? So it's not like I'm going to go kill somebody because of the fact that I didn't get what I wanted, right? It's, if not this time, maybe next time, right? My own sense of this inheritance of a negation through which Sopti introduces herself is that it has something to do with how Sopti's writing emerges only when she recedes and yields instead to a force, a compulsion coming from yet another way of making her hands an instrument for another. So, when he says over there that the truth is, she says, that the soul of the writer and the soul of the story both hover around the table. Suddenly you become someone other, each word a body, a soul, a smell. It is your hands that are moving, but you feel the presence of someone other who's writing. If you claim that it is you who are writing, the characters line up and warn you. It is not you, Sahib, it's we who are making you write. Right? So this notion that in order, when I'm talking about the female voice, I'm not saying this is the woman speaking in this way. I'm saying it's the ability in a certain sense to recede, to come forward, to allow a whole lot of plurality and multiplicity to come within the voice. So the other theme is the normative domestic, and I think you'll enjoy hearing it, so I'm going to read a little bit of it, which is, one day she's attending a party, and I don't know if you know how Sopti used to dress, she would dress like a Mughal princess, right? And so one of the women, she says that one of the women, she says she hit me with a floury stick. With eyes washed in milk, dripping with sweetness, she took my measure with the eyes of a concerned mother and said in a very gentle voice, "You seem to be the kind who's fond of music and dance." And she said, when I understood what the implicit insult was, right? That she said, I handed over my eyes like a camera to her. And that night, Sopti dreams that she is actually dressed like a Saki. She's beautifully dressed. She has this wine jug in hand, right? And, and she says, you can see Mitro Marjani coming into Krishna, right? So why I'm saying that is that, I cannot resist giving a fragment of the scene from Mitro Marjani that comes closest to the image of Krishna Sopti as a Saki, carrying a wine jug, etc. So we know the kindly woman might not have directly called her style and mode of dressing as being taken from the Kota, but the dream image Krishna shows how the image of Mitro was being fused with the image of Sopti. And hence, you want to hear why I'm saying that. Here is the denouement, not the end, but the denouement of Mitro Marjani. So Sardari, her husband, Mitro's husband, and she are away in the natal home. And generally the idea is that, her mother will make room for her to have other lovers. But what happens is this. Seductively, with the wine jug in hand, as she, that is Mitro, walked in the gate of nymph, Sardari felt she was some heavenly beauty from Basra. She kept the jug on a stool and looking into the eyes of her husband said, "You do not recognize your own Mitro? Forget for tonight, my Bhole Balma, that Mitro is your ritually wedded wife. Let yourself imagine today that Mitro is Lalbai, the famous courtesan of Sangrur." Spreading his arms, he said, "So come here then, you Lalbai, let's take your measure then." Now, if you read Mitro Marjani, you will remember how stern Sardari was, right? Every time, even if she dressed too much, he would say, "Why, ye kote waliyon ke nakhre kaise hai? Why are you dressed like that?" So here what you have is that fantasy is not expelled from the everyday, nor does it dissolve into the skepticism of the male subject. Am I really the cause of this pleasure? Which is, underlying, which is Sardari's problem. He cannot believe that he can cause this much pleasure in this woman. So the domestic becomes over here. That is to say, Krishna says she was very disappointed with Mitro because she said, why did she accept these bonds of domesticity? But she misses the fact, and so the writer can also miss their characters, right? She misses the fact that Mitro has already brought the erotic into the domestic. So the last bit, which is about Hashmat's gift, which is really through some meandering path once. We don't need to know whether this is imaginary, whether this is real. Hashmat has wanted to read a Pakistani magazine called Panch Darya, And he learns that Amjad Bhatti, the editor, is going to be there. So they end up in Amrita Pritam's house with Imro's presence, but not Amrita, right? And what I want to give you is how they begin to talk, and that there are these, it starts first by Imroz saying to Hashmat Sahab, Amjad says to Hashmat, Hashmat Sahab, I am a person from Lahore. Today, at least, let's talk in Punjabi. Let's not talk in Urdu and Hindi. And so, Imroz supports him. And so we imagine that there is talk going on in Punjabi. And Imraj Bhatti recites his poem. This is all in Punjabi. Right? So you can begin to see, you begin to hear the cadences of Punjabi, even though she will not let the reader actually hear a Punjabi, right? So there's an exchange on popular authors in Pakistan. How has Lahore expanded? Hashmat's heart starts yearning for Lahore. Anarkali, Mall, Jail Road, Nisbat Road. But when he looked at Amjad, there was not even a shade of recognition of this yearning. Amjad reads out his own poetry from a diary that he carries with him. This and the other poems he recites are the only strings of words we hear in Punjabi in the whole 4 volumes of Hum Hashmat. Then at one point they return to Lahore. The splendor of Lahore, very much there. The cool breezes, they flow as ever, make us well. And those warm hearts of the Lahoris, brimming with passion, as always, they are there, Hashmat Sahab. We, Hashmat, wanted to ask more. Then suddenly the flag of the new nation began fluttering between us. In utter confusion, Hashmat asked, are there sarson ka saag and makki ki roti there too? Amjad Bhatti seems to grow 10 years older. Hashmat Sahab, what you want to know, I understand. Let it go. But yes, I can tell you that mustard greens and corn roti is cooked in the same way and smeared with ghee the same way on that side as on this side. The last glimpse of how Hashmat gets up, shakes Amjad's hands, this Amritsari Lahori boy. All right, Your Highness, Badshah, go make your country prosperous. If you can remember, give them our salam. Tell them there was a time when we too were the inhabitants of the same nation. Reading this essay, I thought this was the most complex rendering of voice I've seen. Nowhere does Sopti allow her voice to be marked as female, not through grammar, not through dramatic cues. The encounter in this way is possible because it is Hashmat who speaks. Yet the texture of the text is suffused by the swirling affects of Krishna and Sopti. Krishna had never allowed herself to speak in Punjabi. Sopti resolutely keeps to the half tones of Punjabi, but refuses to be seen as a Punjabi writer. Through Hashmat, she now participates in a conversation in Punjabi, though she will not allow her reader to hear the sounds of Punjabi coming from her mouth. We as readers do not hear Punjabi, but we can read the poems aloud and relive the scenes of Amjad, reciting his poems in Punjabi, and through the mediation of Hashmat, see Krishna allowing herself to participate in a Lahori evening. The last question that stumbles out of Hashmat's mouth on whether the sarson da saag and makki di roti is made in the same way there as here, it could only have been a woman's question. Yeah? So in a recent writing on Wittgenstein and feminism, Loggias made the point that it's not that we can apply Wittgenstein directly to feminism. And, very major book has come out on Wittgenstein's contributions to feminism. But what has happened is precisely that vulnerability of everyday life, the vulnerability of language, which is typical of the female voice, which comes up in that. So it remains for us, so what I want to say over here is, in the writing of Krishna Sopti and her quiet acceptance of Hashmat as a male presence within her own body of writing, we find a fierce defense of Hindi energized by many tongues and a weaving together of domestic, erotic, and political scenes that all demonstrate how the female subject can absorb the masculine voice without being overtaken by it. Hashmat's street oratory, his confrontation with language purifiers, his encounter with young Lahori editor, all are at one level episodes in a male voice. Yet they are composed, sustained, and given their ethical pitch by Sopti's own investments in the ordinary. The cadence of street calls, the taste of makki ki roti and sarson ka saag, the remember rhythms of partition cities, the figure of the courtesan smuggled back into the domestic. It remains for us to ask if anthropology, and by implication social science, can receive this gift of thinking in the feminine mode from literature and thus find a joining of ethics and politics in the reinstitution of life. The female voice in the movement of thought as a descent into the ordinary is not to shun reason but recognize other paths. The multiple and complex overlap among Sopti, Hashmat, and Krishna shows us how the female voice might be defined not only through forms of exclusions, abrogation, and the stance of unintelligibility. They are all there. I'm not saying that the burden of not being recognized, not being made intelligible, assuming all the oppressions, they're all there. Nevertheless, we also see the plenitude that Krishna Sopti audaciously makes her own and allows us to make ours. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Veena Das, for such a fantastic, eloquent lecture. Ladies and gentlemen, now the floor is open for question and answer. I request you to put your question very briefly and also identify yourself. We'll take 3 questions in one round and then we'll continue like that. Mike. Please identify yourself, sir.
Myself is Umesh Prasad Singh. I am Umesh Prasad Singh, a student of English literature in the University of Calcutta. 30 years ago I studied, and then my attention was arrested when you started speaking on the subject and also mentioned about feminism. Feminism relation to collective consciousness, which you mentioned, and also conceptual formulations. Conceptual formulations, collective consciousness with respect to individual consciousness, and in relation to feminism. You mentioned beautifully and it was wonderfully exposed and also it was expounded well. Interest when you were delivering this main talk. That's my idea. Will you please kindly just elaborate on it, on this particular phase?
Okay. Right. Thank you, sir. Yes, please. Lady here. Yeah, Mandra.
I'm Mandira. I'm Center. I want to ask a question, Veena Das, to you. You started with European and anthropology and many other subjects, but you concluded with Krishna Sopti, Amrita Pritam, Nimrod and others. Why have you chosen the characters from Indian literature in context to so many European and other sociological, philosophical, metaphysical and other subjects? Could you tell us?
Okay. One more question, please.
Sorry, can I ask this question?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much for this wonderful lecture. I am Dr. Bidhan. I teach sociology at Ambedkar University, Delhi. My question is, now you're speaking about voice, and you are trying to somehow deploy the voice in reinstituting life. And you took up a particular writing which came in the early 2000, and it is about encounters, which actually propelled me to ask this question. I had written it down. I can hand it over to you. I wanted to ask this in the context of female voice and by asking the question, or probably turning the question in a different dimension by saying that, I mean, it's not just about can the female speak, it's also about when the female speaks. And I'm trying to be a little bit structuralist here, but I would like to also briefly mention one encounter which probably symbolically provide a lot of thought to think about. And this happened to me in a milk booth, and I went to buy a pack of milk when there's this middle class lady who comes to me and hands me over a membership form of a political party. And I politely refused. I said that I don't want to be part of any political party because I'm a teacher and so on and so forth. And then this lady suddenly becomes very violent, and she says that why don't you don't think that our leaders are doing good? You don't think that our leaders are not doing enough? And within few minutes, I can see that a few other people have joined, and there was a chance that I could have been lynched at that point. So in that kind of a concept, I mean, I think from 2000 to 2026 right now, the very idea of a life lived, as you have been emphasizing a lot in your talk, has tremendously changed. And in that kind of a situation, I wanted to repeat that question: when the female voice speaks, where the agency comes from. Thank you.
You got a question?
Sir, excuse me, sir. Excuse me, sir.
Yeah, thank you for all three questions. I think that there is a certain sense. One was, why do you take European examples? And I think the whole point about Krishna, for instance, is precisely that the female voice for her is not the voice of identity. I mean, it is a voice in which she can, in fact, as I said, she can actually absorb a male voice in the body of her own writing and recognized it. Actually, she calls it Hashmatiya Tukra, which means basically an adjectival, an adjectival entity. So not really an entity who is a substantive entity, but an adjectival entity. And so the notion over here of saying, I was interested in seeing what is it that allows a certain way in which thought is supposed to be enveloped in Europe. And so it's not to cite them, I thought it was not to cite them as my authorities, but to say what exactly is wrong with that, and to be generous in that, to be able to, in one way, offer a particular way in which correction can happen, not through occupying the same space of reason, but really coming to it through an entirely different modality in some ways of voice. So the second, the other question was around voice, and I think there I might have misled you into thinking about the voice in very literal sense. I certainly think of it in very concrete ways that Krishna Soti makes it available. But the idea of voice over here is both a grammatical voice, right? So as a grammatical voice, what you have are things like active voice, passive voice, middle voice, and and she's able in some ways to not use the notion of even the vocative, which is a grammatical entity, and in Sanskrit, usually vocative is something which stands outside. It's a comment on the sentence, right? It's not part of the sentence. What she does is to make it part of the sentence through Heshbot's voice. So in some ways, there is an amazing innovation that she is actually able to offer without actually pronouncing it by very big, heavy-sounding words. And I was hoping to entice you into thinking that theory does not come dressed as theory. You know, it can come in very gentle ways, and that's what happens with Sukti, which I find utterly fascinating and extremely innovative. But you know, if you're going to give me examples to say a woman said that and that is voice, then I'm sorry, I've probably misled you into thinking that it's a very simple kind of idea. Every time you hear a woman speak, you are hearing voice. Whereas my argument was quite the opposite. So that's why I said it's a male voice that she is, you know, in Harshmat, it's a male voice coming through the writing of a woman. So to say. You're thinking of Gayatri Spivak, and I think that's a question best put to Gayatri. I don't want to, you know, I don't want to speak for her. But obviously, for me, the issue is not like that women cannot speak. But what are the processes of subjectivation through which the kinds of exclusions which were done on the mad or on the criminal could not actually be simply replicated for women. I cannot tell the story of subjectivation in relationship to women in the same way that I could tell the story of subjectivation in relationship to the mad or in relationship to the criminal, in relation to the theory of punishment or the history of punishment, right? And I think it's that I was trying to say. A lot of people have said, oh, Foucault did not take women very seriously. But the question is what allowed him to not do that, given that they are women, not only in his writing, but in all the texts he studies. For example, in Seneca's writings, you know, where he has the letters to his wife or the letters to his mother, they are always pedagogical, right? So his mother is heartbroken that he is leaving, and she knows that he has been asked by Nero to commit suicide. But all he does is he actually gives her a lecture of saying how she should be stronger rather than recognizing the actual voice that his mother is articulating. So my problem is not Gayatri's problem. I think that my problem is a very different problem here. Can I see?
Sorry.
Can I see?
Yeah.
It's an online question.
Online
Okay.
question. Yeah.
So you say, can a knowledge system born from the Cartesian moment ever truly accommodate the female voice without demanding that women unlearn embodiment in order to be heard, or is women's historical silence not a lack of voice at all, but the product of a rational epistemology that consistently refused to recognize embodied truths as legitimate knowledge? Okay. So the Cartesian moment in Foucault, when he evokes it in the Hermeneutics of the Self, is accompanied with, it's a problem of method for him, right? He's talking about three reflexive modes. He's talking of memory, he's talking about method, and he's talking about, I forget the third one. So as a method in relationship to the Cartesian moment, what he's saying is that it's that I don't have to do any self-transformation. As a knowing subject, I only need to know, and that's sufficient. Whereas in the pre-Platonic or in the Roman period, whether it's the Epicureans or whether this is the Stoics, or the Cynics, some kind of self-transformation was necessary in order for knowledge to happen at all. And the Cartesian moment splits that, right? And because it splits that, it then assumes that no self-transformation is necessary in order for knowledge to become the one that pronounces the truth, right? I don't think, these are questions that are best formulated as saying, can it truly accommodate the female voice? Because you will notice that Krishna doesn't actually ever talk about access to truth. That is the Cartesian moment which then makes Christian confession at the heart of self reflection, right? But this is not, there's no confessional mode in a certain sense in Hum Hashmat. It's a certain mode of critique that she's able to do in relationship to accommodating the male voice, right? But it also, what I tried to show in the end, I mean, there's something very, very delicate about the fact that Hashmat is able to give her back the gift of Punjabi. And I think if you don't recognize that, and you're repeating in some ways, very well-known social scientific things to say this is embodiment, or this is, this is mind, or whatever. And I'm trying to say there's a different language waiting for us to actually acknowledge and make our own. And if we do acknowledge and make it our own, we need to, as I said, we don't need to reform that Cartesian moment, we need to abandon it.
Now,
So
the
that would
second
be-
round of questions. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Manoj from National Law School, Bangalore. So, in Life and Words, you speak about how when you interviewed the women survivors or people who had experienced partition, they would not render their experiences neatly into speech. It would often come off as speech done otherwise. And you also refer to, for example, Mandodari and Gandhari's kind of articulation of their grief, and even today in Krishna Sukti's kind of articulation of speech through Hashmat. And my question is, how do you think this mode of doing speech otherwise, or it's not exactly silence, right? How can that be the ground for theory and knowledge, or what you were calling the limits of the knowing subject?
So the whole point about Jocelyn Benoit, who I cited, and which is the point precisely from Life and Words, thank you for reading it so closely. I mean, the whole point of Life and Words is that the knowing subject is a disappointment, right? That partly because it assumes that skepticism is a debate which we can win once for all, whereas the argument in Life and Words is that this is a quotidian battle that has to be fought every day, right? And in some ways, I mean, I say very clearly there that the speech can be overwritten by somebody else's voice, right? So there is a distinction between speech and voice, which is why I've gone into the aesthetic voice and the grammatical voice. Now, it's not that the grammatical voice, by definition, gives you the modes of subjectivation, right? But what I've tried to argue is that instead of the knowing subject, what one has to start with is the acknowledging subject. So I don't have to have certainty to know that you are in pain, right? And in fact, in my later work, you will see I bring up Wittgenstein's notions about primitive response, which is when he says that your immediate primitive response in seeing somebody who's, like holding their hand like this, your child is holding his hand like this, the mother doesn't say, am I certain that he is in pain? Her first instinct is to help the child. So in things like torture, what happens, and if you see my book, Slum Acts, you will see that, what happens is the primitive response is blocked, right? So, and there's a very nice book by Richard Rickman called Les Vivants, which is a fictional novel, but which is about the Cambodian genocide, where he shows once the Khmer regime is over and these women are walking in the forest, there's one woman who slips and falls and the other one picks her up, right? This was forbidden during the Khmer Rouge period, right? Or in torture victims, one of the things when we sleep, we often do is we put our hands around, we have a protective gesture towards ourselves. Part of the torture thing was people would be parading those who are being who were tortured, because they would want to protect themselves, to hit them on the hand because they had to sleep with their hands like this, right? So in one way, I would just add that to Life and Words, I wasn't clear then about the primitive response, but I was very clear about the acknowledging subject. So say, how can we have knowledge is to defeat my argument, which is you don't have to have certainty. Knowledge is not the Panacea. I think it's the acknowledgement through which we can come to when we come to knowledge through that route, we assume that error is something which is normal to life.
Yes, madam.
Yeah,
Anjali Bhatia, LSR, Lady Shri Ram College, Department of Sociology.
Can you just speak in the mic?
Okay, I said Anjali Bhatia, Lady Shri Ram College, Department of Sociology. So, Professor Das, a very elevating lecture. Thank you so much, though you call it a descent into the ordinary. My question is, I was reflecting on this project of reinstituting life. And we began by referring to Durkheim, and it takes one's mind to things. So in the project of reinstituting life, is it expunged of things? Are there things at all? And what would be the status of things if that be the case?
Thank you, that's a great question. Oh, sorry. Okay.
Yes, ready to decide?
Good afternoon, good evening, ma'am. My name is Soumya. I am doing my PhD from Jamia Millia Islamia from Department of Sociology. I have widely read your work. Specifically, my question towards your lecture today is about the descent into ordinary. My concern is specifically towards the concept of ordinary in itself, while your work, Life and Words, and Social Suffering with Arthur Kleinman and others specifically mention of this word called as poisonous knowledge coming from the act of witnessing. Have you ever personally felt while going onto the field where you personally felt that the ordinary is not there anymore, while on the surface it might feel peaceful and ordinary on the extent, but in the internal there are so many actions that breaks into the ordinary and brings back the not ordinary place per se through words or through language? Like you mentioned in the last excerpt itself ki makke di roti and sarson da saag, who made it? Is it still being made? Like these questions are still being present in particular scenarios when you specifically go to the field.
Take one more. Yes, please. That side.
My name is Kartar Kapoor. I'm a student of comparative studies in the evolution of history. Ma'am, I need your permission to speak in Hindi rather speaking in English, because I can express better.
आप हिंदी में बोलिए ना.
Okay, ma'am. मैडम आपके भाषण को सुनकर मैं एक बात से हैरान हुआ हूँ, वो मैं एक्सप्रेस करना चाहता हूँ कि we started from the tribal society in the nativism, from the natives, right? We have reached over here. आज हम बात कर रहे हैं कि आज क्या हो रहा है. मेरा प्रश्न ये है कि जो ट्राइबल सोसाइटीज वर्ल्ड ओवर है, तो फीमेल वॉइस जो है, फीमेल वॉइस इन द ट्राइबल सोसाइटीज, फीमेल वॉइस इन द ट्राइबल सोसाइटीज कहाँ से चला और कहाँ पहुँचा, और हमारा जो समाज है इस वक्त चल रहा है, फीमेल वॉइस जो इसका है और उसका, इसका कंपैरिजन क्या है? थैंक यू.
Okay.
Female voice, Indian outside.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so let me just say for the first two, both great questions. So I don't know if you noticed, but I speak about reinstituting life, not necessarily just form of life. So in Wittgenstein, the decisive thing is form of life, and Cavell says, there's a vertical horizon, there's a vertical and a horizontal aspect. And very often, the vertical aspect has been taken to mean biological life. And I'm actually arguing that there are not just two, but many, many dimensions. And by reinstituting life, I'm trying to say it's not just that life obviously needs form in order to be made visible. By reinstituting life, I'm saying that it means that from the singularity of life, there have to be ways in which there is a movement outward into rules, into institutions, into whichever externalities have to be dealt with. So, in my ethnographic work, for example, when you think about, and that's the point about singularity, I've tried to say that you don't actually see life somewhere, right? You only see it in singularity. However, the reinstituting, it's actually an analogy might be, we used to think earlier that, only after a great illness does the body need to repair itself. Now we know that actually DNA is getting broken 7,000 times a day, right? And so the reinstitution is happening all the time, right? And so I'll just give you one example. if I asked myself during COVID-19, how did poor families survive? They survived through the work of women. And they survived through the work of women because women had extremely sophisticated understandings of how to manage money. So, in some of the work that I've done, I've tried to show that there were at least 5 financial instruments that poor families used, in order to have the circulations of money necessary to put food on the table, to see that the child's education does not get disrupted, to see that other illnesses can be dealt with, and so on. So by reinstituting, that's what I mean. I don't mean just that you can give it a particular form, right? That's that's the question. That's what is, and I owe it really to Jocelyn that he did an amazing presentation on Life and Words after the French translation came out. And I think he picked this up from Life and Words to say that what you're talking about is not just form, but reinstitution. So that's the direction. The second question that you had was about female voice. I'm not very given. One of the things that I tried to do was to say that if in the end we are just going to have the same boundaries, to say this is the West, this is India, this is, I'm trying to think of a more dynamic way of thinking where you don't end up by basically creating, simple boundaries of the sort that we are all familiar with. So in that sense, so there are clearly, let's say, if you look at things like testimony of rape victims, you will find everywhere that standing in a court, a woman's locutionary competence is doubted, for example. So those are things you can do a comparative thing if you're doing historically something like even in the subjectivation. Is there a difference between the way, because fantastic similarities in the antiquity period and the Bhagavad Gita, for example, in the manner in which asceticism is brought into the picture. So those can be useful things, but I try not to do things which would just satisfy me by giving you some general answer for which, you will have no use and I will have no use, right? So I think it's really the specificities of it that once you have a very specific curiosity, I could address that question better. But thank you, I will think more. आपने जो सवाल किया, तो इसमें आप जो कह रहे हैं कि औरत की आवाज़ का प्रश्न जो है, तो अगर आप इसका मेरा एक रामायण के ऊपर काम के ऊपर एक ऐसे है, एक निबंध है, जिसमें कि एक चीज़ जो मैंने उसमें कही है कि वो मतलब हम जो आप रामायण देख लीजिए, महाभारत देख लीजिए, कालिदास देख लीजिए, ये वाला चीज़ के एक औरत का सवाल जब पूछा जाता है, जब द्रौपदी का वस्त्रहरण किया जा रहा है, तब वो कई उनसे पूछते हैं कि ये क्या धर्म के अनुसार किया जा रहा है. कोई युधिष्ठिर कहते हैं ये तो बहुत कॉम्प्लेक्स सवाल है, मतलब बहुत जकड़ा हुआ सवाल है, इसका सीधा उत्तर नहीं दिया जा सकता. या फिर वो विदुर से पूछते हैं, क्योंकि विदुर सबसे ज़्यादा विद्वान थे, और विदुर कहते हैं कि मैं इसका कोई जवाब नहीं दे सकता है. तो ये चीज़ जो है कि जो इंटेरोगेटरी वॉइस है, जो प्रश्नात्मक सवाल हमारे शास्त्रों में लिखे गए हैं, जो कि औरत की आवाज़ में भी आ सकता है, कभी मर्द की आवाज़ में भी आ सकता है. जब वली को राम ने मारा तो वली ने कहा कि क्या तुम वही राम हो जो यहाँ पर धर्म को इस्टेब्लिश करने के लिए आए हो, जो यहाँ पर धर्म को बनाने के लिए आए हो. तो ये जो इंटेरोगेटरी वॉइस है, ये बहुत पुरानी आवाज़ है. तो इसको एक रूप देने के लिए हम देख सकते हैं कि कृष्णा सूक्ति का भी लिखा जो है, उसमें भी ये सारे जो ये जो माइथोलॉजिकल वॉइस है, जो कि ये वाली जो आवाज़ है, वो बिल्कुल दुरुस्त है. तो आपका जवाब मैं वही दूंगी कि आप ये आप अगर शास्त्रों को भी पढ़ें तो आपको लगेगा कि ये जो फीमेल वॉइस है, जिसको कि मैं फीमेल वॉइस कह रही हूँ, जो कि औरत की आवाज़ है, इसको ये कोई खाली छिपी हुई आवाज़ नहीं है, इसका उत्तर नहीं है किसी के पास.
Okay, for paucity of time, we will not be able to take any further questions. So we have received 3 questions in writing. Madam, I will pass on these questions to you. You can read them and answer them.
Okay. Anamika Yadav, in the lecture you show how women reinstitute life through ordinary acts rather than dramatic forms of resistance. How might we read women's refusal or inability to fit in, not as breakdown but as an ethical response to a deeply troubled social order? I think you have given the answer. I mean, you know, that resistance in some ways over here as a refusal to fit in, whatever you mean by refusal to fit in, is actually, I would just say that you need to think more in terms of maybe, or with me, to think about the fact that you cannot actually have a rule following unless you are improvising. And women are improvising all the time in relationship to how, in fact, we may speak about following a rule. And Wittgenstein himself says that when I said following a rule, we were speaking mythologically, right? And so in one way, it's not like some people fit in and some people don't fit in. I think this is a constant process of trying to make your culture your own, and in that sense, getting it to respond to individual lives. But thank you for that question. Sunita Dhal, my question is, how do we sustain the collective voice of feminism in relationship to fragmentation of social movements of different kinds? I'm sure at some other time, if I gave you a talk on that, I would be able to answer that in greater detail. This is not about social movements. I see your concern about fragmentation. I would again say it is normal. You know, when we think about somehow some perfect ideal, then I think we begin to fail. Navya Srivastava, what are 3 waves of feminism? Wikipedia is a very good thing to look at.
Okay. Okay, thank you, madam. Thanks a lot for your wonderful talk. Your talk has, given a lot of food for thought for each one of us, and we'll certainly be looking forward for more such talks by you at the IIC. So before we end the program, may I request Mr. Rahul Sharma to kindly propose a vote of thanks.
Thank you everyone for joining in here today. On behalf of the Council for Social Development and the Social Change team, it is my privilege to deliver a vote of thanks for this evening's 8th Social Change Annual Lecture. We are deeply grateful to Professor Veena Das, Professor Emerita of Anthropology at Johns Hopkins University, for delivering such a profound and thought-provoking lecture on the female voice, reinstituting life. Her reflections on vulnerability, the ordinary, and the invisible labor of women in reinstituting life have offered us not only intellectual insight, but also a deeply human lens through which to rethink society, theory, and everyday existence. The richness of her scholarship and the clarity of her voice have left a lasting impression on all of us. And we must be echoing in our mind through one quote how she has emphasized on reinstituting life and not reforming. Thank you so very much. We extend our sincere thanks to Mr. K.N. Srivastava, Director, India International Center, for graciously chairing the session and guiding the proceedings with his thoughtful presence and experience. Thank you, sir. We are thankful to India International Center for hosting this lecture and providing a space that continues to nurture dialogues, reflection, and engagement on issues of social significance. Our appreciation also goes to our colleagues from SAGE for their continued support for such engaging and scholarly conversation and knowledge dissemination. Thank you. We are also thankful to Dr. Riaz Ahmed, editor of Social Change Journal, published by SAGE Publication, for the continued effort and coordination with SAGE to facilitate the event, sir. Thank you. I would also like to acknowledge the effort of the entire social change team at the Council for Social Development, whose dedication and meticulous planning made this event possible, as well as everyone who joined us here today and those who have participated through the live stream with us. Thank you all for being part of this enriching evening. We look forward to your continued engagement and social change annual lecture series next time. Till then, thank you so much. Good night.